All right, today we're going to talk about the history of psychology, which is chapter 14 in the Fast Track book. Remember, you kind of use this lecture before we start talking about it in class, so you kind of have some prior knowledge of some of the terminology that I'm going to talk about. Now, of course, starting with the history of psychology, you have to start with obviously the definition. And psychology is the study of the mental process and the science of behavior. Now, the most important thing to understand is psychology originated from philosophy and physiology. Those were the roots of psychology. Now, in terms of the contributors of philosophy, this includes Socrates and Plato, which believed in something called dualism, and that is the mind and the body are separate. Okay? This really fulfills the idea that the belief that ideas are innate or born with, which eventually you're going to see leads into the nature versus nurture argument. Now, on the other hand, Aristotle came up with the idea that the mind and the body are the same, that they experience things together. Now, John Locke furthered Aristotle's thought and believed in something called tabula rasa. Tabula rasa was that we are like a white blank sheet of paper, that simply we come into this world and experiences simply write upon them. And that more or less supports the nurture side of the argument. Now, René Descartes basically tried to summarize or make both sides of the argument happy with a term called interactive dualism. He still believed that the mind and body are separate, but simply that the mind and body interact on a level that involves or results in experience. So again, this all filtered into what we call the nature-nurture argument. Nature meaning genetics, nurture meaning environment. A good way to remember nature is simply it's natural, your natural tendencies. People have natural tendencies or natural gifts. Some people are naturally, born to remember things. Some people are naturally born to run fast. That is the nature side of the argument. The nurture side of the argument believes that the environment plays a role in determining who we are. In other words, we're factors of the people around us, such as our friends, our school, our work, and our family. Now, this all led down to, kind of filtered into something called empiricism, or empirical data. This is important because to separate psychology from philosophy, you have to have empirical data, which basically means it's based on knowledge from experience or observation. Direct experience or observation. It's not speculation, it's not intuition, it's not somebody guessing. Now, kind of a check question here. Psychology is defined as A, the unconscious mind, B, behavior and mental process, C, overt and measurable behavior, D, working to reach one's potential, or E, how nature selects organisms. If you chose B, then that's the correct answer. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of behavior and mental process. A second question that came from that original slide. Tabula rasa refers to the idea that the mind is like a blank slate on which experiences are written. B, looking inward at the atoms of the mind. C, revealing the wishes and motivations of the unconscious. D, a way to reach self-actualization. Or E, how nature selects organisms best suited for survival. Now, if you picked A, empiricists believed that the mind was a blank slate on which experiences were written. This idea went against the beliefs of the older philosophers. Again, empirical data is simply direct observation or experience. Now, Wilhelm I is considered in history of psychology as the father of psychology. Now, the reason why he's credited with that position is simply he started to introduce laboratory techniques. He started to bring the science into psychology to separate it from philosophy. Now, mainly, a couple of his major contributions was he wrote the Principles of Physiological Psychology, which simply argued that psychology should be considered a scientific study, and that is a well-known book. Also, he opened the first laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879, which 1879 is credited with the birth of psychology. The main thing why this is the birth of psychology is simply he used a laboratory type of condition. And again, philosophy is based on intuition and speculation quite a bit. He was bringing the science or empirical data into play. Now, his first experiment dealt with sensory reactions to stimuli. And he used a technique called introspection, which he's credited with. And it's a technique to look inward, measuring conscious experience. Now, he found that the quality of the stimulus produced different types of responses and emotions. So what he found out was if he flashed a certain light, that color light or that strength of that light would indicate a different type of sensory reaction within the brain. And so what he was really looking at was stimulus response conditions. Now, in terms of a check for understanding question, the method Wilhelm I used to study the elements of the mind was called A, observation, B, case study, C, introspection, D, dream analysis, or E, resistance. Now, if you chose C, that's the right answer. Introspection meant to look inward. Okay. Now, school structuralism was a school that basically launched from the ideas of Edward Titchener, who was a student of Wilhelm I. Now, structuralism, what's special about the school was it was really the first organized school of thought. And it was based on the idea that conscious experience could be broken down into structures or parts, much like a puzzle. So structuralists were interested in showing how these parts were interrelated, just like simply the goal of a puzzle is to put the pieces together. You put the pieces together, it gives you an idea of what the picture looks like. And that's the same with trying to figure out how human beings, act, think, and feel emotions. You take these parts, you assemble them, you account for who the person is. Now, the problem was structuralism was based on introspection. And introspection, over time, was proven not to be reliable because the subjects reported different thoughts when presented stimuli at different times. And what that meant was you could have one person who saw a red light one day respond a certain way, see the same light the next day, and because it's a different day, would respond differently. So in terms of introspection not reliable, it's because subjects kept on reporting different types of responses to the same stimuli. Now, this technique did, however, pave the way for later schools of thought and questioning. So this was really a launching board, and that's why structuralism is always mentioned in the historical timeline of psychology. Now, William James and the School of Functionalism. William James was was credited with being the father of American psychology. Now, he was a physiology teacher at Harvard, but later became more and more interested in psychology. Now, in 1890, he wrote a book that was influential, that popularized psychology in America, called The Principles of Psychology. And this took him about a decade to write. Now, his ideas led to the School of Functionalism, which is the study of how an organism functions and adapts to its environment. Where Wilhelm I and William James, why they're considered the fathers of psychology, is they brought in physiology. They brought in the study of the mind, the study of the body. So they added to what Socrates and Aristotle, Locke, and Descartes had started with philosophy. So they brought in the element of simply scientific technique, okay? Now, functionalism, which was the school that William James heavily influenced, was simply, it looked at how organisms function and how it adapts to its environment. Now, this was different than structuralism. Structuralism looked at simply the components that made up who we are. So they looked at the pieces of the puzzle, whereas functionalism looked at simply how we adapt and how we react to certain things in the environment. Now, this was basically following the work of Charles Darwin. Okay, Charles Darwin, in his theory of natural selection, was of special interest to the functionalist, because natural selection is simply the belief that innate necessary characteristics are passed from generation to generation, enhance our survival, and enhance our ability to adapt. Now, they relied on natural observations and not introspection, which made functionalism a little bit more believable and reliable to the people that were following their work. He also focused more than the structuralists on conscious experience, which he referred to as the stream of consciousness, which we'll talk about in another chapter. That simply we are, affected by what we're exposed to, which again is the functionalism. Now, functionalism led to developments in education, work, and family upbringing. Now, follow-up question, which school of thought focused on how organisms adapt to its environment? A, structuralism, B, Gestalt, C, psychoanalysis, D, behaviorism, or E, functionalism? Now, if you chose E, that's the correct answer. Now, to kind of flip that question around, the ideas of William James agreed with which psychological school of thought? Was that A, structuralism, B, functionalism, C, Gestalt, D, psychodynamic, or E, behaviorism? If you chose B, functionalism, that is the correct answer. Again, they looked at simply how organisms adapt to their environment. Now, legacy of William James. William James influenced quite a few people that made major contributions to psychology. G. Stanley Hall was a student of James and was credited with earning the first PhD in psychology in the United States. He also started the American Journal of Psychology, as well as, most importantly, what he's credited with, is he began the APA, which is the American Psychological Association. Now, Mary Whiton Calkins was mentioned in history for one main reason, was she was a student of James. She finished all of her work for her PhD, but Harvard would not endorse this because she was a woman. So she was left with, so to speak, a blank degree. She had all the requirements done, but she did not have the certificate to prove it. However, despite that setback, she became the first woman president of the APA, opened one of the first psychology laboratories at Wellesley College, and developed a technique to study memory. Now, you should know, Margaret Floyd Washburn, a student of Titchener, was actually the first woman to receive her PhD in psychology. And again, she had resistance. It was only after she transferred to Cornell University that she was able to get this endorsement. Now, she later became the second woman president of the APA and wrote a book, Animal Behavior, which influenced the school of behaviorism, which we'll eventually talk about. Now, Sigmund Freud, which is mentioned in several chapters that we're going to cover in this course, kind of just set the groundwork for Freud. Freud believed that personality and behavior could be explained through the role of the unconscious, which anytime you hear the word unconscious, you're going to know that's Freud's area. And this is an area of ourselves that we're unaware of that has an effect on how we act and who we are. Now, there were several techniques that Freud would use to try to study the unconscious. Dream analysis, which that was a big field for him. Resistance, things people don't want to talk about. Freudian slips, or slips of the tongue, people that say things that they didn't mean to say, which Freud said there was never any accidents. And then these areas could access the unconscious, which when we talk about methods of therapy, we're going to see his area of psychoanalysis came up. Psychoanalysis was his therapeutic approach that arose from his ideas that were presented in the psychodynamic approach. Okay. Now, Sigmund Freud, just as a follow-up question, believed that A, research should be based on observable and measurable data. B, reaching one's potential by developing a positive self-concept was important. Nature selects organisms best suited for an environment. Cultural and social backgrounds play a crucial role in development. Or E, unconscious motivations and wishes affect personality and psychological well-being. Now, if you chose E, that's the correct answer. And again, unconscious is always going to be tied with Freud in the psychodynamic camp. Now, John B. Watson is a very important figure in terms of the second half of the definition of psychology. I started this off by saying psychology is the study of mental process and behavior. This pulls in the science of behavior now. And this is an American, type of school. Now, in the 1900s, behaviorists started to question the role of consciousness. They thought that there was too much emphasis on the way we think, or mental process. And they basically came up with the idea that there should be more of an importance placed on overt behavior. Now, overt means observable. Now, what they thought is that behavior has to be simply observed and measured in order to be studied. That's key. Mental processes, for the most part, a lot of times is speculation. Now, this led to more of a scientific approach that embraced psychology. And again, this was your empirical data. Empirical data is based on fact and direct observation. Now, also what led to the ideas of behaviorism was the work of Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist that worked with the conditioning of dogs, which simply, when we talk about learning in the learning chapter, conditioning is something that can be directly observed. Okay, and that is stimulus response type of behavior, which again, if you want to make the connection between what I said in the beginning, Wilhelm Wundt started to look at this when he was flashing things to people and saw how they respond to different lights or different sounds. Now, in America, Watson extended the work of Pavlov, but also focused on environmental stimuli in terms of how it could shape behavior. This really, what Watson's credited for, is things that we look at like incentives. He was looking at simply how the rewards and consequences that people are presented with could have an effect on their behavior. For in other words, getting extra credit after raising their hand, or having something taken away in terms of eliminating a behavior. Now, like Watson, B.F. Skinner, who was another influential behaviorist, focused more on the role of reinforcement and punishment, which you will hear those terms in the learning chapter in terms of positive and negative reinforcement. Okay? Now, in terms of a couple follow-up questions, behaviorism was built around the idea that A, research should be based on observable and measurable data. B, reaching one's potential by developing a positive self-concept is important. C, nature selects organisms best suited for an environment. D, cultural and social backgrounds play a crucial role in development. E, unconscious motivations and wishes affect personality and psychological well-being. If you chose A, you are correct. Behaviorism is based on overt or observable behavior. Now, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow are responsible for the initiation of a third type of force looking at behavior, and that's humanistic thought. Humanistic emerged in the 1950s, and this is kind of the good feeling type of perspective of psychology. It's referred to as the third force in psychology. Now, they focused on how free will and human desire and potential shape behavior. In other words, our wants, our desires, what we want to get out of life. What they are looking at is simply the pursuit to be successful, how that affects who we are as a person. They basically believe, Rogers and Maslow believe, that human potential is what separates humans from animals. That our desire to be successful, our desire to achieve, our desire for satisfaction is something that animals do not encompass. Now, Rogers, like Freud, developed his theories from working with people in therapy. Remember, Freud basically worked with people that led to the field of psychoanalysis. However, Rogers disagreed with Freud on the importance of the unconscious. The big stink that Rogers had with the unconscious is, one, it was not able to be measured, which the behaviorists really, that's what they attacked on Freud, that you could not measure the unconscious because we're unaware of it. They always believed that it had to be measurable data. Rogers believed the same thing, that there was not enough evidence that there was such a thing as the unconscious, mainly because we couldn't see it, we couldn't measure it. Now, Rogers focused rather on unique potential and mental growth. What drives us? All right, one of the terms he came up with, which we'll talk about in another chapter, was our actualizing tendency, actually realizing what we're capable of doing. Now, he also disagreed with how much emphasis the behaviorists placed on punishments and rewards. He believed that was more temporary in terms of having an effect on us. Just because somebody gets extra credit doesn't mean you're going to change who they are. Now, Abraham Maslow, who we'll talk about in the motivational chapter, developed something called the pursuit of self-actualization, which is self-mastery, being the best you can, being at the top of your game, being the smartest, the brightest, the fastest. Self-actualization is simply the pyramid at the top, of what we strive to get to. Now, a couple of questions. Rogers and Maslow developed which perspective? Evolutionary, psychodynamic, C, behavioral, D, cognitive, E, humanistic. If you said D cognitive, well, you'd be wrong. The answer was E, humanistic. Okay, that they believed that free will, self-determination, and the importance of the self-concept, which gave rise to the humanistic perspective. Now, psychological perspectives. Different psychological perspectives have shown that there are different ways and methods to view and study mental process and behavior. One thing you have to kind of warm up to in this class is that there are many ways to explain human phenomenon or the way things happen. And you have to open your mind to the different perspectives. Now, you may align more to one perspective than another just because of personal experience or simply you can identify with their theories. But the main thing is in psychology is you have to look at all the perspectives. Now, the main perspectives, okay, biological is, simply their influence was physiology. Now, biological, which we'll talk about in one chapter, looks at the brain, the nervous system, and the endocrine system in terms of how it affects our behavior. So obviously when we look at simply the components of the brain, and especially if there's damage to those components, how they affect personality as well as behavior. Behavioral genetics is nature-nurture. They look at primarily the role of genetics and environment to factor, which type or which influences the most. Psychodynamic, which we talked about, was Sigmund Freud's area, and they emphasize unconscious as well as early life experiences. Freud's people believe that things that happen in childhood have a direct effect on the way we act in adulthood. Now, behavioral, which we talked about, which was Watson, Skinner, Pavlov, and Albert Bandura, which will be mentioned in another chapter, again, they believed in overt behavior. Anything scientific has to be measured, has to be observed. Humanistic, which we talked about, was Rogers and Maslow. They believed in the importance of the self-concept, which is who we are. Free will, our ability to choose what we want to do. Self-determination, how we chase down our goals in life. And eventually how we, measure human potential. Cognitive, which is a word you're going to see, was simply tied to the cognitive abilities or the way we think. This was Jean Piaget, Noam Chomsky. They looked at mental process, thinking, language, as well as how we solve problems. Cross-cultural, which was one of the newest perspectives, emerged in the 1980s. And they looked at simply the role of diversity. How does cultural background affect our behavior? How does the way we're raised, where we're raised, and what kind of environment are we raised? How does that have an effect on the way we act? Evolutionary, which is Darwin, and the Origins of Species, which was a famous book that he had wrote, looks at simply natural selection, how nature selects organisms that are best suited for survival, and how that plays a role in terms of our behavior and overall development. Now, a couple questions. Who contributed to the ideas of the evolutionary perspective by suggesting that nature selects organisms best suited for survival? If you chose letter A, Charles Darwin, that's the correct answer. Now, the belief that the brain and the nervous system affect behavior is fundamental to which perspective of psychology? A, evolutionary, B, psychodynamic, C, behavioral, D, cognitive, or E, biological. If you chose E, biological, that's the correct answer. They emphasize the brain and the nervous system. Which perspective is concerned with how information is processed in terms of thinking, remembering, and communicating? A, evolutionary, B, psychodynamic, C, behavioral, D, cognitive, or E, biological. Cognitive refers to thinking, so if you chose D, that is the correct answer. A researcher supporting which psychological perspective might recite the following quotation. I believe that the memories and invites of early childhood contribute to unconscious development affecting personality. Most of you probably got that right away because we've said unconscious several times in this lecture. But A, evolutionary, B, psychodynamic, C, behavioral, D, cognitive, or E, biological. Again, unconscious is always tied to psychodynamic. If you were saying, what about psychoanalysis? Remember, psychoanalysis is the therapeutic part. It's used in the treatment of mental disorder. Now, the specialization areas of psychology, these are broken down of the perspectives. These are areas that people go into of interest. They're more specific. Now, basic research, psychologists, either do basic research or applied. Some do both. But basic research provides studies that enhance the knowledge base of psychology. And what they're looking at is simply developing theories and developing different viewpoints. Applied research are psychologists that go out and apply or use the psychology in everyday life. So basically it starts here. This is the book. This is building the pages of a book. That's basic research. This is selling the book outside to people and having them use what's in the basic research books. So applied research is simply taking a theory and having people utilize it or develop it. Now, obviously some of the perspectives, that these are areas of psychology you can go into. Now we're going to talk about all these in various chapters. A couple that I'll highlight, which we haven't talked about. Developmental psychology, they play a huge role in how people develop over time. And that's of interest. People want to know simply early childhood, adolescence, adulthood, how people change. Personality psychologists look at personality. Health psychologists, which is a growing field, look at simply, for example, the effects of stress, lifestyle, on our longevity, which obviously people, and why health psychology is coming into play even more is because the baby boomers are getting older in life. Evolutionary school or educational school psychologists, these are people that work on administering tests, helping people or students learn. Industrial organizational, which we'll talk about in a chapter, deals with allowing the workplace to work better. Working with people, having them develop their skills, get along with coworkers a little bit better. Social psychologists, that's obviously looking at the effects of society on the way we act. Clinical psychologists, that's probably the most well-known. Those are people that treat mental disorders or people that have certain problems. Counseling psychologists, which is a version of a clinical psychologist, more deal with people of milder types of disorders. Psychiatrists, which we're going to talk about. The big difference between psychiatrists and clinical psychologists is psychiatrists can issue prescriptions. They have a medical degree. Now, psychometrics, when we talk about intelligence, these are people that write testing that test our aptitude as well as our achievement. And community psychologists is one of the fastest growing. These are people that go into neighborhoods and make sure people who have disabilities or have, or don't have the ways or methods of getting to certain clinics or psychologists' offices are given proper treatment. These are people that go out into the community to make sure people are taken care of. Now, a couple follow-up questions. Which subfield of psychology studies how people change over the course of a lifetime? Change is obviously the big word there, okay? And change is another word for which one of these? Cognitive psychology, B, clinical, C, psychiatry, D, biological, or E, development. And the correct answer, if you chose E, developmental psychology, look at how people change over their lifetime. Now, when describing her job, Jenny says that she makes sure that people who need psychological care receive it. Jenny is which type of psychologist? A, cognitive, B, clinical, C, community, D, biological, and E, development. The answer for this one, if you chose letter C, community psychologists make sure that people who either cannot seek help or are unwilling to do so receive the proper treatment. Another question, which subfield would focus on how a stroke could affect the functioning of the brain? Now the key word in that question is brain. Okay, so which one of these perspectives do you think matches with brain? Cognitive, B, clinical, C, community, D, biological, or E, development? If you chose D, that is the correct answer. Biological psychologists look at simply how the brain and as well as the endocrine and the nervous system affect human behavior. Okay, that's it for History of Psychology, Chapter 14, and we'll talk about Chapter 1 next time.